The air in the dusty Texas ranch was thick with anticipation, and the unmistakable smell of bacon sizzled from the kitchen. Yet, as the Japanese POW women were handed their first American meal, they recoiled in horror, refusing the food without hesitation. A group of cowboys and American soldiers, standing by in confusion, had no idea that their kindness would be met with outright rejection. What could have caused this strange defiance? The answer lay not in the food, but in the trauma and terror they had endured. For 3 weeks, the women refused all offerings, convinced that the enemy had something far darker in mind than the warm meals being served. But when the cowboys discovered the devastating reason behind their refusal, the shock was enough to shake their beliefs about the brutality of war and its lasting scars. The women's arrival had been quiet. The trucks had rolled in under the heat of the Texas sun, the air thick with dust. They stepped off slowly, their faces pale from exhaustion, their bodies frail. The guards, rough-faced men with broad shoulders and weathered hands, stood silently, unsure of what to expect. The women had expected cruelty, humiliation, anything but the strange silence that greeted them now. As they shuffled forward, each step seemed like a struggle, their movements slow and hesitant. Their gaunt bodies made it clear that they had been through horrors no one should endure, and yet their eyes, sharp, suspicious, and alert, told a different story. They had learned, over the course of the war, that survival came from distrust, and the Americans were no different from the monsters they had been taught to fear. The barracks they were assigned to were simple: wooden floors, thin mattresses, the air smelling faintly of hay and dust. But compared to the filth and overcrowding they had experienced in other camps, these felt almost too clean. They sat in silence, eyes darting to the soldiers watching them from a distance. They had no idea what to make of this new reality. The women were told that the Americans were a barbaric enemy, that they would starve them, humiliate them, and strip away their dignity. But here they were, surrounded by soldiers who did not shout or berate them. They stood at a distance, watching with wary curiosity, unsure of what to do with these prisoners who did not look like soldiers at all. Instead, they looked like broken civilians. As night fell, the meal was announced. The smell of sizzling bacon and fresh bread wafted across the camp, mingling with the cool night air. The women were led to the mess hall, where the guards stood with trays of food. But when the food was placed in front of them, a strange silence fell over the group. None of them reached for the food. They stared at the plates with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The bacon, the bread, it smelled like something they hadn't had in months. But their minds were not yet ready to accept this. They had been trained to see kindness as a trick, to believe that the enemy's gestures of generosity were meant to break their resolve. The first refusal was barely noticed. A few women shook their heads. Others backed away slowly, as if the food itself might leap up and strike them. The soldiers watched, confused. They had expected resistance. But not this. This wasn't defiance. It was fear. The women, despite their hunger, refused to eat, the trauma of their past too strong to allow them to trust what was offered. For them, survival was not just about food. It was about holding on to the last shred of control they had left. They had been taught to fear the enemy's food, to fear anything that came from them. The idea that the Americans might offer something as simple as a meal without strings attached seemed impossible. The refusal wasn't about pride or rebellion, it was about survival instincts shaped by years of war. They had lived through months of starvation, their bodies hollowed by hunger, and they had learned to distrust everything, even the food in front of them. The women had been taught to fear surrender, to believe that to be taken prisoner was a fate worse than death. And now, with food that could save them, they couldn't bring themselves to accept it. The women's thoughts were still anchored in the brutal past. Japan, at war for so long, had bred them into soldiers, but also into something more, believers in a narrative so twisted that it had become their truth. The war had turned the air they breathed into a weapon, the food they ate into a symbol of survival or death. They had been taught that surrender was a dishonor worse than death, that falling into enemy hands meant torture, starvation, and humiliation. The images they had seen were etched in their minds, fellow soldiers falling in battle, bloodied and broken, but refusing to give up their lives in the hands of the enemy. They had been trained not to hesitate, to believe that any other fate would be unthinkable. The very foundation of their lives had been shaped by propaganda. They had heard the broadcasts, read the pamphlets, and been fed stories of how the Americans were monsters, soldiers who would strip away everything that made them human. They knew that surrender meant disgrace, and the fear of becoming one of those dishonored captives who would face unimaginable horrors was deeply ingrained. Even now, standing in this strange foreign land, their minds were still captive to the stories they had been told. The war was over, but its legacy lingered, an invisible force pushing them to see the Americans as nothing more than the enemy. At the ranch, their reluctance to eat was more than just fear of poisoning. It was a refusal to break from everything they had been taught. Despite their hunger, they could not bring themselves to trust the food. Their minds remained locked in the past, and even the simplest gestures of kindness from their captors seemed like an illusion. The idea that their enemies could be anything but cruel, anything but barbaric, was beyond comprehension. The women could not fathom a world where their survival wasn't tied to fear. They had been trained to believe that honor was the only thing worth fighting for, and surrender was the greatest shame. To accept food from their captors was to accept that surrender wasn't the end. The idea that kindness could come from those they had been told to hate was a challenge to everything they had ever known. For the first few days they pushed away the food, their hands trembling with fear, their minds trapped in the lie that to eat was to accept defeat. But even in the face of that fear, something began to shift. The hunger was undeniable, gnawing at their insides, and the kindness of their captors, despite their resistance, began to feel like a strange kind of life, a life they never expected. It didn't come easily. The propaganda they had been taught had given them a weapon, a defense against the enemy. But now, as they looked at the food, as they looked into the eyes of the soldiers offering it, their defenses were crumbling. The fear didn't vanish, but a question began to form. What if we've been wrong? In the silence of the camp, in the warmth of the Texas sun, the women were faced with a new reality, one that didn't fit the narrative they had been taught. It was a reality that didn't make sense, but it was one they could no longer deny. The fear of the enemy had been ingrained in them for so long, but here, in this moment, it was slowly being replaced by something else. Trust. It wasn't instant, it wasn't easy, but it was a beginning that would lead them to question everything they had ever known about war, about survival, and about the enemy they had been taught to fear. For 3 weeks the women had resisted, their bodies hungry and weak, yet their minds held firm in the beliefs they had been taught. The food offered to them, so abundant, so simple, felt like a betrayal to everything they had fought for. And yet, as the days wore on, their hunger gnawed at them more than ever. The smell of food became more unbearable, a constant reminder of what they needed and what they refused to accept. The first day the meal was presented to them, the air in the mess hall seemed to thicken with tension. Hot stew, soft bread, bacon, crisped to perfection. It was food they hadn't tasted in so long, food they'd dreamed of in their worst moments, and yet here it was, in front of them, a trap they could not yet trust. They stared at it in disbelief, their bodies trembling not with hunger, but with the weight of the fear and shame that gripped them. The propaganda that had taught them to see food from the enemy as poisoned, as a tool of torture, had not faded from their minds. This was a moment of crisis. Should they risk everything for the warmth of the meal in front of them? Could they let go of the past and accept this small piece of comfort, knowing the cost? For some of the women, the hunger outweighed the fear. Tentatively, they reached for their bowls, their hands shaking, but their desire for food overpowered their doubts. Their eyes flicked nervously to the soldiers watching them, as if expecting some cruel trick to reveal itself, but when no punishment came, they brought the food to their mouths. The stew was warm, rich, its taste overwhelming in its simplicity. It was food, real food, the kind they hadn't had in months. The warmth spread through their bodies, and for a moment they allowed themselves to forget the war, the hunger, and the fear that had followed them across the ocean. But even as they ate, the guilt surged within them. How could they do this? How could they accept food from the enemy, knowing what it represented? The act of eating felt like an unspoken betrayal, not just of their captors, but of everything they had believed in, of their families, their country, and the war they had fought for. Their minds were still shackled by the lies they had been taught. To eat was to concede that the enemy was not as they had been told, that the war had not been about honor, but about survival, and that survival was more complicated than the black and white narratives they had been raised on. The hunger in their bodies clashed with the fear in their minds, and each bite became a battle. Others, more reluctant, watched their fellow prisoners eat, but they couldn't bring themselves to follow. The thought of surrendering to their captors, even in something as simple as a meal, was too much. They had been taught to despise this food, to fear it, and the internal conflict was too great to overcome. They couldn't let go of the shame, the belief that they would dishonor their families and their ancestors by accepting the enemy's kindness. But the hunger was unbearable. It roared inside them, pushing them toward the edge of their resistance. As the days passed, the women who had once rejected the food began to soften. Their bodies weakened, but the desire for peace, for something beyond the war, started to overtake the voices in their heads. Slowly, some of them started to eat in secret, hiding their actions from the others. Their eyes darted around the room, nervous, as if someone might catch them, as if the simple act of eating would lead to their undoing. But when the food touched their lips, they knew this was survival, not surrender. Yet even as the women began to break, there were still many who refused to eat. The internal battle raged on. Could they ever reconcile their hunger with their fear? Every bite they took was a painful acknowledgment of what the war had done to them. The act of eating was no longer just about sustenance, it was about their survival as individuals in a world that had changed beyond their understanding. The food they had been told was poison became the very thing that kept them alive. But with it came a deeper realization. Survival meant more than just eating. It meant confronting everything they had been taught to fear, and ultimately to let go of the past in order to live. The days stretched on, each one feeling like a small eternity, yet something subtle began to shift. The initial distrust the women had felt toward the Americans started to wane, if only slightly. It began with small acts, those fleeting moments of kindness that chipped away at the walls of fear they had built around themselves. One morning, a cowboy who had been standing at the mess hall, noticing the women's hesitance, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small packet of cigarettes. He offered it to one of the women, who took it with a cautious glance but no word of gratitude. There was no mockery in his eyes, no gleam of cruelty. The offer was genuine, like a silent understanding. She had expected nothing from her captors, but this simple gesture, unremarkable to the soldier, made her wonder about the truth she had been taught. Could the enemy be capable of such gentleness? Another day, one of the guards went out of his way to help an older woman with a heavy basket. He carried it with ease, even though it was clear she had struggled to lift it. As he walked beside her, he kept a respectful distance, offering only small, careful words in broken Japanese. He didn't expect thanks, nor did he demand acknowledgement. She didn't respond, but felt the weight of his kindness nonetheless. The act didn't make sense, yet the kindness was undeniable. The women had grown up in a world where the enemy was defined by their cruelty. Yet here, in the presence of the very men they had been trained to despise, something was unraveling. The lines between friend and foe were not as clear-cut as they had once believed. The women's distrust slowly turned into curiosity. A few of them began to take small steps toward communication, tentative and unsure. At first it was through gestures, a pointing at objects, a nodding of heads. They had learned just enough of the language to make basic requests, but it was the expressions on the soldiers' faces, their eyes, that began to speak louder than words. The Americans were not the brutes they had been taught to fear. Their voices, when they spoke, were not filled with anger or mockery, but with a quiet patience. A few women, starting to lose their fear, began attempting small words of English, each sound an act of defiance against the indoctrination they had carried with them. They were not just learning a language, they were learning to connect, to break down the walls that had separated them from humanity. One afternoon, a cowboy approached a woman who had been particularly silent. He smiled gently, offering her a handkerchief to wipe her brow. "Hot day," he said, his accent thick and unfamiliar, but the kindness was unmistakable. She hesitated, her face rigid with disbelief, and then, for the first time, she spoke, just a few words in broken English, but the effort was enough. "Yes," she said, looking him in the eye. She hadn't known whether the Americans could be trusted before, but in that small exchange, something inside her shifted. It was a slow process, like the thawing of ice, but the cracks in her armor were beginning to form. The realization dawned that their captors were not the faceless, heartless monsters they had been taught to hate. They were people, flawed and imperfect, but with their own stories, their own struggles. Slowly, the American soldiers began to take on a human dimension that had been absent in the women's minds. No longer were they the embodiment of evil. They were simply men, living their lives, doing their duty, and, at times, showing kindness where none had been expected. It wasn't easy for the women to trust. The teachings of their youth were not so easily erased, but each small act, each smile, each word, each small gesture of kindness was a thread unraveling the deep-seated fears they had lived with for so long. And, with each unraveling, they were one step closer to realizing that survival was not just about enduring, but about understanding that perhaps their enemies, too, had been shaped by forces beyond their control. In the quiet of the camp, the women began to talk among themselves. They were still cautious, still fearful, but the conversation, once stilted and wary, was now filled with curiosity. Could they really trust these men? Could they truly abandon the beliefs that had held them captive for so long? There were no answers yet, only the beginning of a journey they hadn't expected to take. It was a morning like any other when it happened. One of the American soldiers, a man they had grown used to seeing but still didn't fully trust, approached them with a tray. On it sat something foreign yet familiar, a cup of steaming coffee. He held it out to the nearest woman, his eyes cautious but not unkind. The aroma of the coffee, rich and warm, drifted through the air, mingling with the crispness of the early morning. For a moment, the woman stared at the cup as if it were a threat, unsure of what to do. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was more tangled than her body. Could this really be a gift, or was it another trick to break them? The soldier held the cup closer, offering it once more. She hesitated. The last thing she expected from the Americans was something as simple as a drink. The war had taught her that such gestures were reserved for the enemy. In her mind, every kindness had a price. But the soldier didn't press her. He just waited patiently, not expecting anything in return. Slowly, she reached out and took the cup from his hand. The warmth of it seeped into her fingers, and she brought it closer, inhaling the smell, so familiar and yet so alien in this strange place. With each sip, the world around her seemed to soften. The bitter taste of the coffee mixed with the warmth of the cup, and, for the first time since she had arrived in America, something inside her relaxed. The heat spread through her chest, reminding her of the mornings back home before the war had consumed everything. The coffee was simple, yet it held a kind of comfort that felt like a distant memory. The warmth was something she hadn't realized she craved, and it was here, in the hands of the enemy, in a place she had feared to exist. Around her, the other women watched quietly. Some still hadn't moved to take the cup, unsure if the warmth they felt was real or if they were simply caught in a moment of weakness. But one by one, the women began to reach for the coffee. Each sip was accompanied by a shared look, an acknowledgment of the bizarre normalcy they had been thrust into. The coffee was a symbol of something they hadn't expected, something that did not align with the years of fear and propaganda that had shaped their lives. As they drank, the emotional turmoil inside each woman began to take root. They were not only questioning the food they had been given, but the kindness itself. Could something so small, so human, really be offered without strings attached? The women had been conditioned to believe that the enemy's hand would always come with a blade hidden behind it. Yet here they were, accepting a simple cup of coffee, unsure of how to navigate the emotions it stirred within them. How could they reconcile this with everything they had been taught? How could they accept that the Americans, the very people they had been trained to see as monsters, were now offering them warmth and comfort? The struggle within them intensified as they realized that this simple act of care, offering a drink, a moment of warmth, was no longer a trick. It was real. The comfort was not fake. The reassurance they had been given through the coffee was genuine, and in that quiet moment, they began to question everything they had believed about survival, about honor, and about the enemy. The war had taught them to fight with everything they had, to resist, to fear. But now, in the strange silence of the camp, they were learning that survival was not just about fighting, it was about accepting the humanity in others, no matter how unlikely the source. Back in Japan, their memories were filled with starvation, with cold nights, huddled under makeshift shelters, with the relentless pursuit of victory at any cost. Life was harsh, and comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford. But here, in a foreign land, they were being offered warmth, not just in the form of a cup of coffee, but in the form of kindness. This was not the enemy they had been told to expect. The contrast was staggering. They had been taught to fight for honor, to fight to the death. But now they were faced with a new reality, one where the enemy wasn't the monster they had imagined, but a person who, despite everything, was capable of kindness. It was a truth that couldn't be easily accepted, but it was a truth that would change everything. As the days passed, the small, seemingly insignificant acts of kindness from the American soldiers piled up. A cup of coffee in the morning, a warm jacket offered when the nights grew cold, a soft smile when a woman was struggling with her work. Each gesture, each moment, felt more like a thread unraveling the tightly wound fabric of their belief system. The women began to open up, if only slightly, to the men around them. A few started to speak in broken English, asking questions, trying to learn about their captors as much as they were being taught to adapt to their new world. At first, these conversations were awkward, laden with uncertainty and distrust. But slowly, some of the women began to respond with hesitant curiosity. Yet, with every interaction, a new discomfort began to take root. The kindness they were receiving, so simple, so human, was beginning to feel like a betrayal. How could they accept this? How could they stand there, receiving such gentleness, when their entire lives had been shaped by a belief in the righteousness of their cause? The thought gnawed at them. Survival was what they had been taught to fight for, but at what cost? Was it worth giving up everything they had been raised to believe in simply to stay alive? For some, it was a bitter pill to swallow. They were haunted by the idea that accepting this kindness meant they were admitting defeat. It wasn't just about food or warmth, it was about their identity, their sense of self. How could they remain loyal to their country, to their families, if they accepted this mercy from the enemy? The propaganda they had been taught had painted the Americans as ruthless invaders, as monsters without compassion. But now, faced with their humanity, they didn't know how to reconcile the two. Each day, the moral struggle between survival and betrayal grew more intense. The women tried to convince themselves that they were simply doing what was necessary to survive. After all, what were they supposed to do? Refuse food? Refuse warmth? Refuse help? But the inner conflict raged on. They could feel the pull of guilt, the weight of shame pressing down on them every time they accepted something from the soldiers. And yet their bodies, starved and weary, could not refuse. The kindness, however unsettling, was something they needed, but each time they took it, they felt as though they were losing a piece of themselves. The psychological toll of adapting to this new reality was wearing on them. They had been trained to see the enemy as inhuman, a faceless force bent on their destruction. But now, the Americans were showing them a different side, one that didn't fit into the narratives they had been taught. The kindness from their captors seemed almost absurd at times. They had expected cruelty, punishment, anything but civility. Yet here they were, treated with dignity, with respect, even as prisoners. It made them question everything: the war, the propaganda, their own roles in it. They had been taught to hate, to fight, but now they were confronted with the painful realization that their enemies might not be the monsters they had been led to believe. And with that realization came a quiet tension. An unspoken question hovered in the air between them and the soldiers. Had they been wrong? Could it be possible that their entire world view had been built on a foundation of lies? The women began to talk to one another more, sharing their doubts, their confusion. Some tried to resist, clinging to the beliefs that had sustained them through the war, but others began to soften, accepting the humanity of the men around them with growing unease. The tension wasn't just between the women and their captors, it was within themselves. Every moment of kindness forced them to confront the gap between what they had been taught and what they were now experiencing. It was as if their entire identity was being tested. They had survived the war by clinging to one simple truth: they were the good ones, and the enemy was evil. But now, in the face of human kindness, that truth was starting to crumble, piece by piece. The conflict was tearing at them, pushing them toward a painful truth: their survival Their very existence might be linked to giving up the very ideas they had fought for. In this strange new world, where the enemy offered comfort instead of cruelty, the women didn't know who they were anymore. And that realization, unspoken but felt by all, was the hardest thing they had yet to face. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the barbed wire, a new kind of silence settled over the camp. The women were gathered in their quarters, sitting on their cots, each lost in thought. For the first time, the soldiers allowed them the space to write letters. The idea had been suggested quietly, almost as an afterthought, but it was a gesture that would change everything. For the women who had once seen communication with their families as impossible, an illusion they had abandoned, the offer of a pen and paper felt like a dream they couldn't resist. A letter home. It was an act that had once seemed like a distant impossibility. The emotional weight of writing that letter was immense. It was not just about putting pen to paper, it was about acknowledging that they had survived. They had been taught that to surrender was to bring shame, but here they were, far from home, surrounded by enemies who had shown them kindness. How could they explain the food, the warmth, the care? How could they put these impossible contradictions into words that their families would understand? The truth was too complex, too far removed from the lies they had been fed. To speak of the kindness they had experienced felt like betrayal, yet to remain silent felt like an even greater crime. One woman, her hands trembling as she held the pen, began to write. The words flowed slowly at first, hesitant, but soon they came more easily. She wrote about the food, how they had been given more to eat than they had seen in years, how the simple act of eating had begun to fill her with a strange sense of peace. She wrote about the warmth of the barracks, the comfort of being able to sleep without fear of air raids or bombings. But as she wrote, she paused. What could she say about the Americans? How could she describe them as they really were? They were not the monsters she had been told to expect. They had treated her with respect, with kindness. But how could she reconcile this truth with the stories she had grown up with? The truth felt like a betrayal of everything she had known, everything she had believed, and yet she could not ignore it. Her pen hesitated over the paper. How could she tell her family, her friends, her countrymen, the truth of her captivity? How could she explain that her enemies had treated her like a human being? It felt like a betrayal to the war, to the loss of her homeland, to the memory of her comrades who had fought and died with honor. The words she wrote were not the words of victory she had imagined in her youth, but the painful truth of survival. She wrote that she was alive, that the food was plentiful, that the guards were not cruel, that the camp was not the hell she had expected. And when she finished, she folded the letter, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just admitted, not to the soldiers, but to herself. What she didn't know was that the letters, meant to reconnect with family, would never make it home in the way she intended. The American authorities, who had allowed the women this small act of agency, had read the letters as part of their routine security. But it wasn't the American officials who would ultimately decide the fate of the letter. When the Japanese intelligence network intercepted it, the ripple effect would be felt across the world. The words written by the women, words that conflicted with the narrative of the enemy they had been taught to hate, shook the foundation of the propaganda that had sustained them throughout the war. The letter, once a symbol of newfound agency and trust, became a weapon in a war of words and ideologies. It disturbed the narrative. The idea of the American soldiers as monsters was shattered by a simple truth. These men were human. And in the hands of Japanese intelligence, the letter would be used to fuel doubts, to stir unease among the ranks, and to spread confusion. It was a truth too complicated to ignore. The betrayal wasn't in the letter. It was in the very act of surviving and acknowledging the humanity of the enemy. The women had written a letter home, not just to their families, but to the world they had left behind, a world that could no longer exist in the way they had known it. And for that, the letter would never reach its destination. As the days passed, the women began to feel the weight of their transformation. It wasn't an immediate change, it didn't happen overnight, but in the quiet moments of reflection, they began to understand something unsettling. They were no longer who they had been. Their old world, their homeland, the war they had fought for, it all seemed more distant, more like a faded dream than reality. It wasn't just the physical distance that separated them from their past, it was the emotional distance that had grown between who they were now and who they had once been. They were not the same people who had boarded the trucks to this strange land. Their lives, their beliefs, had been irrevocably altered by the experiences they had lived through, by the kindness they had received from their captors, and by the slow unraveling of the world they had once known. The most difficult part of this transformation was accepting it. How could they reconcile what they had once believed with the reality in front of them? The world they had known had been built on a rigid set of values: honor, loyalty, duty. These were the pillars that had held them upright, that had kept them going through the darkest days of war. But here, in this foreign camp, those values seemed increasingly irrelevant. The Americans, the people they had been taught to despise, were offering them food, warmth, and even companionship. They were not the savages they had been told to expect. They were, in many ways, as human as the women themselves. It was a realization that left them shaken, unsure of where they fit in this new world. Could they still be loyal to their homeland if their enemies were showing them such unexpected kindness? Could they still cling to the beliefs they had grown up with, or had the war and the captivity already eroded those beliefs beyond repair? As they began to acknowledge this change, an emotional journey unfolded within each woman. At first, there had been distrust, suspicion. They had expected cruelty, humiliation, punishment. But now, as time passed, the emotional distance between them and their captors began to shrink. The kindness they had once rejected now felt like a bridge, a connection between them and a world they had been told to fear. But accepting that kindness came with its own challenges. To do so meant questioning everything they had been taught, everything they had believed. It meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that survival was not just about fighting, but about accepting the humanity of others, no matter who they were. The internal conflict was painful. They had been taught to fear their captors, to hate them. But now, those very men were becoming part of the reality they could not escape. The deeper the women settled into their new lives, the more they realized they no longer knew who they were or what they stood for. They had once been defined by their role in the war, by the identity they had been given as soldiers, as patriots. But now, in the quiet of the camp, in the face of their captors' humanity, those identities seemed meaningless. They weren't sure where they belonged anymore. The war had defined them, but that war was over. What were they without it? The struggle to understand who they had become, who they were now, was intense. The women were caught between two worlds, the one they had left behind and the one they were now forced to navigate. They had no answers, only questions. They didn't know who they were anymore, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than anything they had faced on the battlefield. As they gathered in the evenings, sitting in silence or talking in low voices, the tension between their past and present grew more palpable. Some of them still clung to the old ways, the old beliefs, but others, those who had started to accept the kindness of their captors, felt the pull of a new world, one where survival wasn't defined by war, but by humanity. And with that acceptance came a recognition of their own transformation. They were no longer soldiers. They were survivors, but they were survivors who had changed in ways they didn't fully understand. The questions lingered in the air between them, unspoken, but felt by all. Who were they now? What would they do when they returned home? Would they be the same women who had left, or would they be forever changed by what they had learned in captivity? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was clear: their transformation was just beginning. If you find this story as powerful as we do, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The day of repatriation arrived slowly, like the final chapter of a book they hadn't expected to read. The women, once gaunt and weary, had gained weight, their faces less hollow, their bodies stronger. The wounds of war were still etched in their minds, but their health had improved, and the bruises of the past seemed less sharp. They had learned to survive in a world where survival didn't depend on fighting, but on acceptance, on understanding that humanity could exist even in the most unexpected places. But as they prepared to leave the ranch, something deep inside each woman began to stir. They were not the same people who had stepped off the trucks weeks earlier. In many ways, they were no longer the women who had entered this foreign land. They had changed, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and they didn't know what that meant for their future. The emotional weight of their transformation was not something they had prepared for. When they arrived, they were strangers to everything: the land, the language, the people. They had been broken, weary, and confused. But in the weeks since, they had learned to trust, to accept kindness, to eat without fear, and to laugh in small moments. The camp, once a symbol of captivity, had become something more, a place of transformation, of quiet healing. The kindness they had once feared had nourished them in ways they never thought possible. It wasn't just about food or warmth. It was about the slow rebuilding of something they had lost long ago, their humanity. Yet, as the days passed and the repatriation neared, they felt the weight of the world they were returning to. The war had torn everything apart. The countries they had known, the families they had left behind, were forever changed. What would they return to? How could they reconcile what they had learned in captivity with the world they had come from? Saying goodbye to the ranch was harder than any of them had imagined. The men who had once been strangers were now part of their lives, part of their story. The Cowboys, who had started as their captors, had become something more. Some of the women exchanged quiet words with them. Others simply nodded, unsure of how to express the gratitude they now felt. There was no grand farewell, no fanfare. The women filed into trucks, their bags packed with small items, perhaps a token of the kindness they had received, a memory of the strange peace they had found in this unexpected place. The ranch, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a symbol of something entirely different: survival, acceptance, and transformation. It was a place that would remain in their hearts forever, even if they could never truly go back to it. As they journeyed home, the women carried with them not just their bags, but the weight of new beliefs, new identities, and unanswered questions. What would their families think of them? What would their country think of them? They had been sent away as soldiers, as enemies of the state, but they returned as women who had learned to survive through kindness and compassion. The war had defined them, but the journey had redefined them in ways they could not yet fully understand. The journey home was long, filled with quiet moments of reflection and nervous anticipation. The women were changed, but they were not sure how to present this new version of themselves to the world. The silence between them in the truck was heavy, filled with unsaid words and unasked questions. They had survived the war, yes, but the war that lay ahead, the battle between who they had been and who they were becoming, was a struggle they would face alone. They knew one thing for certain: there was no going back to who they once were. The world they were returning to was no longer the world they had known. They had been to hell and back, but in the process they had found something unexpected: humanity, even in the enemy. The weight of that knowledge was heavy, but it was also liberating. The journey home wasn't just about returning to the place they had left behind. It was about finding a way to move forward, to carry the lessons of the past with them, and to discover what it meant to live in a world that was no longer defined by war. When the women finally stepped off the ship and onto the soil of their homeland, it was not the triumphant return they had imagined. Their bodies had healed, their spirits had softened, but the world around them had not changed. The war-torn landscape was just as they had left it, shattered, scarred, and unrecognizable. The cities they had once known, full of familiar faces and bustling streets, were now rubble. The earth seemed to echo with the loss, the grief, and the years of bloodshed. For a moment, they couldn't recognize the country they had fought for. It was a foreign place, a place that had ceased to exist the moment the war had ended. They had come home, but it wasn't the home they had remembered. The shock of their captivity lingered, still heavy in their hearts and minds. The kindness they had received from their captors, those very men who had once been their enemies, clashed violently with the world they had returned to. It was a world that hadn't changed. The same propaganda that had demonized the Americans, the same narratives that had justified the war, still echoed through the streets and the homes of their families. It was as if their months of captivity, their survival through kindness and understanding, had never happened. The women were expected to resume their old lives, to fall back into the roles that had once defined them. But how could they? How could they go back to the stories they had been told when they now carried a truth so fundamentally different? Everywhere they turned, they were faced with a dissonance between what they had learned and what they had left behind. They had been taught to believe that their enemies were nothing more than monsters, but now they knew better. They had witnessed the humanity of the Americans, their kindness, their willingness to care for people they had once called their enemy. The women had learned that survival wasn't about fighting, it was about finding humanity in places they had been taught to fear. But the world they had returned to wasn't ready to hear that truth. It still clung to the beliefs that had justified the war, to the ideas that painted the enemy as nothing more than an object to be vanquished. The emotional toll of returning home was immense. The women were not the same. They had been changed, not just physically, but in ways they couldn't articulate. They had been forced to confront their deepest fears, their most ingrained beliefs, and now they were expected to re-enter a society that hadn't changed, that hadn't been through what they had. They were no longer just soldiers, they were survivors, and that survival had come with a price. The war had taken everything from them, their families, their homes, their identities, but in captivity they had found something unexpected. They had found humanity, even in the face of the enemy. And that truth was now something they carried with them, like a heavy weight pressing against their chest. Re-entering this unchanged world was a struggle. Their families, their country, had not seen what they had seen, had not felt what they had felt. How could they explain the depth of their transformation? How could they explain that the kindness they had received from their captors was more than just an anomaly, but a profound lesson in survival, in humanity? The women had lost something in captivity, their old selves, but they had gained something too. They had gained the ability to see the world in a way they never had before, a way that made it impossible to return to the narrow views they had once held. But the world around them was unwilling to acknowledge that change. They were expected to forget what they had learned, to return to the old beliefs, to fall in line with the society that had shaped them before the war. And so, in the silence of their homes, the women wrestled with their new truth. The reckoning was quiet, unspoken, but it was there. It was in the way they looked at their families, at their neighbors, at the country they had once fought for. They had been changed by captivity, by the kindness of the men they had once feared, and now they were left to navigate a world that had not changed with them. The tension between the past and the present, between what they had been taught and what they had learned, was something they would carry with them forever. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.